Did the White House just greenlight U.S. military force against Latin American cartels, including operations that could touch Mexican territory? Reports say the Pentagon's been told to prepare options. Mexico's brand new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, responded with a hard line. There will be no invasion. So what's actually happening? What's rumor? And what's politically useful theater? Today, we break down what's confirmed, Mexico's response, the law, the risks, and the real-world consequences, including a surprise mass handover of cartel suspects to the U.S. this week. Stay to the end. We'll separate what's authorized from what's feasible and show how this standoff could reshape security, trade, and diplomacy on both sides of the border. Multiple outlets report that President Donald Trump directed the Pentagon to prepare options for using U.S. military force against Latin American drug cartels the administration has labeled terrorist organizations. Officials told Reuters the posture enables military and intelligence tools, but does not make strikes imminent. Think of it as contingency options on the shelf, not an automatic go order. In parallel coverage and analysis, policy publications summarized that the directive frames cartels as terror threats, aligning with an earlier executive order that set up a process to designate cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, and/or SDGTs, a move that expands sanctions, financial targeting, and material support prosecutions. Subsequent government and legal briefs note 8 groups were designated earlier this year. Mexico's response was immediate and blunt. President Claudia Sheinbaum said at her August 8 presser, "The United States is not going to come to Mexico with the military. We cooperate, we collaborate, but there will be no invasion." Mexico's foreign ministry echoed that it would not accept U.S. military participation on Mexican soil. At the same time, Sheinbaum has leaned into law enforcement cooperation. Just days later, Mexico transferred 26 wanted cartel figures to U.S. custody, the second big batch this year, under a deal that included no death penalty assurances. This came alongside fresh U.S. sanctions targeting cartel revenue streams. Analysts see a hard no on troops, paired with yes on extraditions, intel sharing, and financial hits. Direct kinetic action inside Mexico without consent would collide with Mexican sovereignty and international law norms. Even supportive U.S. policy papers stress the ideal path is consent and coordination with Mexico, and that consent is currently a hard no. International law. The UN Charter bars the use of force against another state's territorial integrity unless there's self-defense or consent. Some legal scholars argue the U.S. could claim self-defense against non-state actors, cartels, responsible for deadly cross-border harm, but it's contested, and consent from Mexico is the cleanest path. Cites at Duke Express. U.S. domestic law. The president can order limited military actions. Congress holds the power to declare war and to fund operations. The administration's terror designations expand tools like asset freezes and material support crimes. But posse comitatus limits the military's role in domestic law enforcement. Overseas actions still need a lawful basis. Legal experts warn about stretching wartime authorities for what is fundamentally a criminal network threat. OFAC, just security. Bilateral frameworks. The old Merida initiative evolved into the Bicentennial Framework, 2021 present, emphasizing protect our people, prevent transborder crime, and pursue networks. That framework is built on cooperation, not unilateral incursions. The U.S. overdose crisis, especially illicit fentanyl, has driven calls for tougher action. Provisional CDC data show a sharp drop, nearly 27%, in 2024 overdose deaths versus 2023, but levels remain historically high. Policymakers argue cartels still pose an acute national security threat, with production and smuggling networks linked primarily to Mexican groups. Washington's escalatory levers include terror designations and sanctions, and this week Treasury announced new actions against a CJ&G-linked fraud/money network. These moves choke cash and limit logistics, often without crossing sovereignty lines. This week's 26-person handover signals high cooperation short of military presence, and it follows a similar mass extradition earlier this year. Analysts also note the timing overlaps with trade issues and tariffs, suggesting security cooperation and economic bargaining are linked. Framing cartels as terror organizations polls well among voters who want stronger border security and faster overdose reductions. Ordering the Pentagon to prepare options signals toughness without committing to a high-risk incursion. Analysts note it also leverages Mexico's incentives, as seen in the extradition wave, and stepped-up cooperation this week. Sheinbaum's stance, no troops, yes cooperation, tracks with Mexican public opinion on sovereignty and a practical need to cool U.S. pressure on fentanyl and migration. That means visible wins, big extraditions, seizures, lab takedowns, while blocking foreign military presence. Expect cartels to adapt, shifting routes to sea and air, diversifying into fraud and extortion, and experimenting with precursor sourcing. The latest Treasury action against a CGNG-linked timeshare fraud network shows how diversified these revenue streams have become, and why sanctions plus financial forensics are crucial. Even with a provisional 2024 drop in U.S. overdose deaths, the crisis remains severe. Any policy billed as a solution will be judged by deaths prevented, not headlines. That's why supply-side pressure must combine with demand-side tools, treatment, naloxone access, and community programs, if we care about outcomes. Imagine waking up to headlines that a former U.S. president allegedly gave the green light to using military force against a neighboring country's criminal organizations, without their permission. That's exactly the explosive claims surrounding Donald Trump and his reported approval of a potential military operation against Mexican drug cartels. The idea? Strike the cartels directly on their own soil, treating them as foreign terrorist organizations. The reality? Such a move could have triggered one of the most serious diplomatic crises in modern U.S. Mexico history. Mexico didn't stay silent. Top officials responded swiftly, calling the suggestion an unacceptable violation of their sovereignty and warning of serious consequences if such an action were ever attempted. This isn't just about politics. It's about national security, international law, and the fragile balance of one of the world's most important bilateral relationships. In the next few minutes, we'll break down exactly what Trump is accused of saying, Mexico's detailed response, and what experts believe this could mean for the future of U.S.-Mexico cooperation. Because when politics, power, and military force collide, the impact is felt far beyond the headlines. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.